and a very warm welcome to Rashmi sir on behalf of whole team of Just Transition Talk Series and Humanities and Social Sciences Department. So it's our absolute honor to have you with us today. Rashmi sir needs no introduction. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with sir's inspiring work. He is a retired IAS officer of 1983 batch. He has been former special secretary in Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change in the Government of India and Chief Secretary, Government of Manipur. He was India's principal negotiator for climate change issues under UNFCCC for several years. And today, Rashmi sir will be talking about climate stabilization issues and policy. And this is a very interesting topic considering that, and a lot has been said on it, broadly speaking. Papers on papers have been written and we read as well. But knowing about this topic directly from Rashmi sir, I'm sure everyone is going to learn a lot from Sir because Sir has been the architect of early climate change policy making in India. Now, with that, I request Dr. Pradeep Swarnakar Sir to join us in welcoming our special guest, Ara Rashmi Sir, and our first time attendees of this event.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Nakar and Zinat and the entire team in IIT Kanpur. First of all, thanks for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. You're all scientists and you are absolutely bright people. So I cannot talk to you about technology and technical things, but I'll try to give you a glimpse about the way this issue has been handled in the last 30 to 40 years from a policy perspective. I'm sure, being students and practitioners of science, much more than I do about climate change as an environmental phenomenon, as a natural phenomenon. But it's that is the whole issue about climate change, that it is apart from being a natural phenomenon, it has entered our lives also as a major developmental issue, the policy issue. So the way the discourse on climate change has progressed over the last 30 to 40 years, I'll try to give you some glimpse of that and then see what are the options before us in trying to handle this challenge. I have divided my talk in 4 parts. So first, I'll talk about the goal, purely in terms of the scientific goal of climate stabilization. And then secondly, the reality, the current reality in terms of global emissions, which are supposed to be the primary cause of the climate change. And then efforts that have been mounted at the global level and within our country. And lastly, the challenges involved in handling this problem at our national level. So you are aware of this IPCC prognosis, but just to summarize the major findings and the nature of the challenge that we face today, the IPCC, the last assessment that is available to us today, has already said that we have entered the phase of history where we are seeing the highest concentration in terms of CO2 and globally warming gases in the atmosphere. The temperature rise has been one of the sharpest in the last 2 decades. And the sea level rise has, again, which is the natural rate at which the sea level rise takes place, that has doubled in the last 30 to 40 years. And if we don't do anything about climate change, then by the end of this century, the temperature rise will be in the range of 3 to 4 degrees over the global mean temperature. And the global mean temperature has already risen by 1 degree in the last 100 years. So something which happened in the last 100, or you can say from the onset of the Industrial Revolution in the last 200 years, that more than that can take place in the next 50 years or by the end of this century. So that is the real problem. And if that happens, then the planet is threatened. The survival of humankind and all the species is threatened. Then we have a very serious problem at our hand. So there was a treaty which the international policymakers signed in 1992, and that defined how we should stabilize the climate, or what exactly is the expectation in terms of stabilizing the climate. You will notice that in this treaty there is no numerical goal. Nothing was talked about 2 degree, 1.5 degree, or net zero. There's nothing in these terms. This treaty essentially talked about stabilization of GHG gases at a level that would prevent dangerous interference with the climate system. And what kind of interference? Human interference, anthropogenic interference. Climate change is a natural phenomenon. We have been seeing the changes in the climate over thousands of years. There is always a certain degree of variability in the climate. And then if you look at the geological time, the climate always changes. The glaciers melt, the sea, the oceans rise, and all kinds of things happen. But what has happened in the last 200 years after the Industrial Revolution started is that the concentration of the GHG gases, which arises primarily from the consumption of fossil fuels and other natural resources, it has increased at a very rapid rate, and it has started interfering dangerously with the climate system. So this needs to be stabilized. The treaty didn't specify at what level, what level, but the expectation was that we need to do something in a manner that it doesn't affect the economic development process. The economic development must proceed in a sustainable manner. The food production, the security, that is the key requirement here. You will be surprised to know that in an environmental treaty, people have talked about food production, economic development, and stabilizing the climate. So these are mutually, I would say, not conflicting goals, but certainly goals which need a lot of management in balancing themselves. Here comes the 2-degree goal. And I have jumped to this 2-degree slide because we have traveled from 1992 to 2015, almost for 20, 30 years. But it's necessary to give you a perspective before I go into the ways in which this has been managed. For the first time, this 2-degree goal was talked about in 2009 in Copenhagen Accord. In 2009, I was present at that climate conference. And before that, in the G20 meeting, or there was a meeting of what is called major economies, headed by the USA at that time. And Barack Obama was the president of the US. He was actually environmentally minded, and he was spearheading this movement towards a Copenhagen Accord, an accord that would change the character of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which divided the world into developed and developing countries as far as climate action was concerned. So he was basically advocating a regime, a global regime for climate change, where there would be no distinction in terms of developed and developing countries, and we would fix a numerical target for temperature rise for the planet as a whole. So in the Copenhagen Accord, if those of you who want to visit this historical part, I can send you a copy of the Copenhagen Accord. For the first time, this figure enters there. In that figure, the accord, they talk about stabilizing the climate at 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level, not more than that. That was the goal. But what does that 2-degree goal mean? In fact, another group of countries like small island developing states and some of the Caribbean states, which are more vulnerable to climate change, they were saying, no, it should not even be 2 degrees, it should be 1.5 degrees. There was a big debate about that, but finally the accord talked of 2-degree goal, and also effort towards stabilizing the climate at 1.5 degree above pre-industrial level to the extent possible. But the catch here is that if you really accept this numerical goal, what does it do to your carbon budget globally and nationally? The carbon budget, which is available to you, is just about 5 to 700 gigatons. The rest of the carbon space, which is required to stabilize the climate at this level, has already been occupied. Occupied by whom? By the countries which have already emitted in the past. So the carbon budget that is available to us now is extremely small. And therefore, the IPCC itself made an analysis, and they said that if we really want to hold this temperature at 2-degree level, the 50-50 probability is that we need to strictly ensure that the global concentration of greenhouse gases does not go beyond 500 parts per million. And as of now, I'm sure, being scientists, you will all know that we have already reached a concentration level of 400 parts per million. So the atmospheric concentration does not leave you a space of more than 100 parts per million in the next 30 to 40 years, at which the climate has to be stabilized. So that is the real challenge. And what is the reality? The reality is that currently we are emitting almost 52 gigatons of CO2 emissions every year into the atmosphere. 52 billion tons of greenhouse gases. And it has risen from 1990, from 34 gigatons to 54 gigatons today. If you include some carbon sink, it may go down to 52. That's it. So the reality is that instead of the global emissions coming down, we are witnessing a phenomenon where the global emissions continue to rise and further accentuating this crisis in terms of concentration of gases. So that is why you see this rapid pace at which the concentration is rising. And who is responsible for this? So that's why I come to this part. Currently, China is the largest emitter in the world, followed by United States. This was not the situation 10 years ago. 10 years ago, United States was the largest emitting nation in the world, followed by European countries, followed by China, and then others. Today, the situation has reversed. And it has reversed because of the economic growth which is happening across the world. Today, China, India, South Africa, and Brazil are the growing countries. The economic growth in all the developed world has come to a halt. Practically, they don't grow more than 1 or 2%. China is growing at 6 to 7% today. India is growing at 5%. All other economies are growing at 5%, more than 5%. If you look at the emerging economies and the developing countries. So that is the real situation today. Out of this 52 gigatons, the largest contribution today is coming from China. But in the past, it has all come from European countries and United States and and Canada and Australia and Japan, the countries which were in the lead and which have contributed extensively. If you the surprising, or rather the depressing part of this story is that despite the fact that the world has realized that the carbon emissions need to be brought down to stabilize the climate, and there is an international treaty in place to mandate the developed countries to reduce their emissions, no one has done that. You can see most of the countries, barring the exception of some of the European countries, like Scandinavian countries, or in the last 10 years, United Kingdom or France, no other country in the world has actually contained its emissions. Japan, Canada, Australia, Germany, all major European countries, United States, every single country has led to a further growth in its emissions, as you can see from the graph here. But if you look at the other side, when you combine the emissions with the population of these countries, the picture changes completely. I mean, the countries which are supposed to be very large emitters, they become very small on the spectrum. India, today it is the third largest emitter, but if you look at it in terms of per capita income, it is 1.7, way below the other major countries. China is at the range of 6 to 7 today, slightly more than 7 now. But US continues, despite the fact that China is the largest emitting country in the world, it is still much lower than European countries and United States. United States continues to be the largest economic power in the country, in the world, which has the highest per capita emissions. So per capita emission is practically related to per capita income. These are correlated. And so therefore, the economic growth levels, economic developmental levels actually suggest where the actions should lie. And that is why the treaty in 1992 mandated that the primary responsibility of reducing the emissions lay with the developed countries, not with the developing countries. And now I'll tell you the story of how this division of the world, how it has changed in the last 20 years. So before that, I wanted to give you a brief overview of India's emissions. India's emissions are currently at a level of 2.5 or 2.6 billion tons every year annually, and largest, of course, comes from energy use, and the rest comes from industrial processes, agriculture, forestry, and the waste. Of course, energy consists of almost 72% of total emissions in the country, and energy means all energy production and consumption, whether it is in residential buildings, commercial buildings, industry, or power production, everywhere, or transport. It's the same information given in a slightly different form, sector-wise. I think you can look at this later. So let me now come to this slide and tell you, given this fact that the emissions have continued to rise in the world, despite a requirement of reducing these emissions in order to stabilize the climate at 2 degrees, how has the international action evolved? And the first action taken by the international community was to sign this treaty in 1992. This treaty essentially divided the emitting countries into two parts, into two groups: Annex 1, non-Annex 1. Annex 1, developed countries, which were told to reduce their emissions as per a global mandate. Developing countries were not given a mandate to reduce emissions, but were asked to take actions to reduce the emissions as far as possible if support was available to them in terms of technology and finance from developed world. That was the basic structure of this treaty. And another distinguishing feature of this treaty was that it said that the developed countries, again, there was no numerical target fixed here for any developed countries to reduce its emissions. It was just a broad goal, just like climate stabilization. There was a broad goal in terms of emission reduction. They were told to reduce their emissions to 1990 levels by the end of 2000. You know, this treaty was signed in 1992, and they were asked to report in the next 10 years to inform the international community of what they have done in terms of, and the goal given to them was to reduce their emissions to 1990 level. As you have noted in the previous slides that I have just presented, that no single country did that. No country did that. And in fact, instead of reducing the emissions to 1990 levels, they continue to rise. And today, they have grown by almost 50% over what the emission level was in 1990. So the UNFCCC of 1992 was followed by a protocol. It's called Kyoto Protocol because it was signed in the Kyoto city of Japan. In that Kyoto Protocol, for the first time, a numerical target was fixed for the developed countries because nobody had actually reduced their emissions to 1990 level on their own. So a target was fixed, and the target was 5%, 5.6% rather, but 5% broadly for everyone. The first and the Kyoto Protocol ran from 2005 to 2020 for 15 years. In this 15 years, there were two commitment periods, and the targets for each of these periods is different. The first commitment period had a target of 5% generally for everyone, for the global international community as a whole. But within the moment the Kyoto Protocol was signed, the US backed out of it. The president of the US said that it will hurt the economic development in US, it will hurt the industries in the US and the US economic interests, so it is not in their interests. And despite the fact that they were actually the leading country for negotiating the Kyoto Protocol, they were the ones who were the first to walk out of it. And naturally, the US not being there Others took Russia did not any targets any further at all. New Zealand walked out, Canada later walked out, and later Japan and Australia also walked out. So the Kyoto Protocol practically failed. But I mean, the other countries walked out much later. The US did not ratify the treaty. But despite the fact that these countries did not meet the targets or did not take significant commitments, Kyoto Protocol ran for 15 years. And one of the achievements of the Kyoto Protocol is that it had something called clean development mechanism, a mechanism where developed countries bought emission reduction credits from the developing world. And the projects which were set up in the developing world, like India, China, Australia, Brazil, and South Africa, the credits given by these projects were bought by the corporates in the developed world to meet their own targets, which was given to them by their countries under the Kyoto targets. So in a way, Kyoto Protocol did not completely fail. It failed in actually controlling the global emissions, but it succeeded in partly fulfilling the financing needs of the developing countries. So that is broadly what happened with Kyoto Protocol. But the essential issue remained there. You know, the US was and did not ratify. Other countries walked out of it later. And the argument given was that unless the major developing countries, which are the source of rising emissions in the world, unless they also took similar obligations, they will not participate in this, nor will they ratify. So that was the crux of the entire debate in the climate arena, that the emerging countries must also take similar obligations. And this distinction of countries between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 should go. And to decide the nature of this obligation, after the second commitment period of Kyoto Protocol would come to an end in 2020, they decided that a new international treaty should be, or a new international agreement should be worked out. And that process began in Durban. I was present in Durban again when this began. There was a huge fight over this because the developing countries continued to insist that Kyoto Protocol is good enough. It requires developing countries, it helps developing countries to reduce their emissions with the financing support from the developed world. But at the same time, developed countries have a numerical mandate, and which they have not fulfilled, so they should continue to fulfill. That time should be extended. But this argument was not accepted, and the nature of the international diplomacy being what it is, finally we had to agree to this new regime, which would come up into in the post 2020 period, and the process of negotiations on that regime began in Durban. Finally, this international agreement took shape in Paris in 2015. And as you will notice here, that the basic feature of this agreement is that the distinction in terms of developed and developing countries has been done away with. There is no annex anymore in this agreement, but the defining feature is that it does not say that the targets for emission reduction will be fixed globally, as in the case of Kyoto Protocol. Here, it gives the flexibility to decide the target to each country concerned. The same flexibility is available to India as also to the US. Although there is obviously a requirement that the developed countries will take lead. That phraseology actually does find mention even in this agreement, that the developed countries will take lead in emissions, reducing their emissions, but no numerical target has been fixed for them. Each country has been allowed to fix its own target based on its national circumstances. And although it doesn't fulfill the global expectations in the way we would ideally like to be, but considering the reality of economic development in the emerging and developing countries, I think everybody was okay with this kind of arrangement, which allows a global goal to be satisfied in the backdrop of economic development. And now, the other key feature of this agreement is that it requires each country to fix its targets and put up that target to submit that target to the international community for the purpose of screening, for the purpose of what is called transparency, that the targets which are fixed, the international community will not go into the acceptability or the reasons why those target has been fixed, but they will examine whether these targets are correctly and rationally fixed, and whether they have been implemented and all actions have been taken necessary within the given resources to implement those targets. So that is another arrangement which has come up under the Paris Agreement. So NDCs, which are called nationally determined contributions, are subject to international scrutiny as well, which is a legal and binding obligation under the agreement. The agreement also does talk about the financing support. The US $100 billion fund, which was created in Copenhagen Accord itself 10 years ago, that has been recognized and that has been continued. But unfortunately, that's a separate story altogether. That fund has actually not helped much. There is practically no resources in this fund. It also talks of new market mechanisms, just like the Kyoto mechanisms. In the Kyoto Protocol, as I mentioned, there were 3 mechanisms, out of which CDM was one. The other 2 were, one was what is called emissions trading scheme in the developed countries, which had mandatory quantified targets for emission reduction. So those countries implemented an emissions trading regime within their countries, like European Union did. The other was clean development mechanism, which was an arrangement between developed and developing countries. And third one was a joint implementation, which was again between amongst the developed countries, project-based financing for emission reductions. Between the emerging, between the what they call countries like US or East European countries and the developed countries of Europe. Similar market mechanisms have been allowed under the Paris Agreement, where the developed countries can offset their emissions and buy emission credits from the rest of the world. But as you will note, since there is no division in terms of developed and developing countries, this mechanism can work the other way around as well. If India, let's say, wants to buy a credit, it can do so from Indonesia. It can buy a credit from South Africa or Europe, depending on its requirement. So this market mechanism dissolves the distinction between developed and developing, and it can, and then under this, countries are allowed to buy credits from anywhere. So that is the essential distinction between this mechanism and the Kyoto mechanism. So what has happened after Paris Agreement? You must have talked about the net zero announcements made by several countries. And this announcement or this emphasis on net zero has come about primarily because of the IPCC report, which came in 2018. IPCC report came up with a special report on 1.5 degree stabilization. And in that report, they said that if the climate has to be stabilized, if the global emissions have to be reduced, the extent to which they should be reduced by 2050, they said it should be net zero. The world must bring its emissions down to almost practically net zero by 2050 if we have to meet this target of 1.5 degree stabilization. What does this net zero mean? It doesn't mean that the emissions will be zero. There can still be emissions, but there must be enough carbon sinks to neutralize them and bring them down to zero. But in the immediate term, they also said that in the immediate and short term, by 2030, the emissions must come down by 45%. And the rate of electrification, the rate of renewable intake into the grid, the rate of the renewable fuel, the low carbon fuels in the transport system, all of this must change drastically and dramatically in the next 20 years. They said that by if we have to achieve net zero by 2050, And if we have to stabilize climate at that level, the share of renewables in the entire energy system, electricity system at least, should be 70 to 85%. And that's a humongous target. I'll come to this point when I talk about India. Coal has to be brought down to nearly zero of electricity production. And in the buildings also, energy efficiency must rise. The transport fuels must be, no longer based on fossil fuels, but based on hydrogen or compressed natural gas or electric batteries. They must be introduced to the extent of 40 to 65%. Now, these are challenging targets by any standards. Whether the world can really do this, it depends on the kind of targets which the countries take under the NDCs. Now, some of the countries have put out their NDCs according to national circumstances, but I must tell you that none of the NDCs actually fit these expectations of net zero goal by 2050. There are many countries which have come up with a net zero goal. At least 12 of the G20 countries I know have come up with a net zero goal. India is one of them now. You must have heard of the Prime Minister speaking about net zero goal of India by 2070. Most of the major countries in the G20, not in the world, but the G20, which basically leads the world to, as far as 80% of the economic production in the world or economic emissions in the world is concerned. They are the leading countries, and 12 of them have announced net zero goal. But I think it is just a goal at this moment, but because the clear emission trajectory by which this can be achieved in terms of by transitioning into low carbon energy sources, nobody has been able to spell out that strategy as of now. The another development which took place was the climate conference in Glasgow, which happened last month, where it was also decided that given this challenging target of stabilizing the climate at 1.5 degree, the current NDCs are completely inadequate. They must be improved by all countries, developed and developing everyone. And secondly, they also decided that the coal should be phased down. There was a huge fight over this issue because India is currently heavily dependent on coal. So it cannot simply say that we will be able to phase out coal in the next 20 years. So, given the kind of discourse which took place there, finally the phase out was changed to phase down without any specifying any time frame. But the climate conference did decide that the coal as one of the primary energy sources will be phased out over a period of time. And the extent to which it can be done will depend on number of factors, and this will have to be incorporated in the growth strategy of the countries as part of their net zero goal. There are other decisions about financing, loss and damage, and adaptation. We don't have the time to talk about that today, so I'll skip that. But these are broadly this is the context in which the recent discussions have taken place. So let me now come to the final part about India. What are we doing and what is it that can be done? Under the Paris Agreement, we have submitted our NDC, our targets, and there are 3 numerical targets there. We have said that we will reduce our emissions intensity of the GDP by 33 to 35%. The second target is in terms of energy transition. We have said that by 2030, we will set up almost 40% of our electricity generation capacity from renewables, including solar, wind, hydro, like that. And we will also create carbon sink capacity of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of additional carbon stock in our forests. So these are the 3 broad targets that we have taken. Fortunately, we have progressed positively on each of these 3. India is actually one of the leading countries amongst the G20, which have actually fulfilled its NDCs, unlike many other countries who have given ambitious targets, but who have not achieved. Australia, Canada, Japan, Germany, US, the story is the same everywhere. They have given an NDC, but they have not fulfilled it. But India has shown remarkable progress in this direction. There are arguments about the quality of this progress. For example, we have said that we have set up almost 38% of our electricity generation capacity from renewables now. If you include large hydro, small hydro, solar, wind, biogas, thermal, everything, then we are almost there. 40% has already been created. But if you look at generation, the feed into the actual energy that feeds into the grid from the renewable sources, it's not more than 8%. Or some, if you include large hydro, it is 12%. So there is a large difference between the production capacity and actual generation. And that is the nature of renewables. And being scientists, you are aware that the reason why this happens is because there is no storage of energy here. The renewable energy cannot be stored as of now. And that is the primary challenge. The other two targets are emissions intensity and the carbon stock. And in both targets, the progress is very good. In terms of emissions intensity, we have already brought it down by 24% against the target of 35%. And this will easily be achieved in the next 8 to 9 years. Forestry target is a little difficult. Though the good thing is that the forestry cover is increasing. I mean, if not increasing, at least it is stable. There is no further deforestation, unlike in the countries of South Africa, let's say Congo Basin or Indonesia or Brazil, where actually deforestation is taking place. In India, forests are not under depletion, but the quality of the forest is not very good. This needs to be changed, but there is potential here which we can utilize for our benefit. So this is basically a graph about the falling emissions intensity. And in fact, some people say that the Prime Minister raised this target to 45% by 2030. It could have been risen even to 50%, depending on the kind of progress that we are making in terms of energy efficiency and energy transition. But that's a different story. So the challenge is that we have to meet the energy transition goals. This is the last slide. The energy transition goals have to be met to be able to reduce our emissions while maintaining the rate of economic growth. And then this requires that we take action on all those three fronts which IPCC has pointed out. That we must increase the share of renewables into our system. We must electrify all our energy systems to the extent possible. We should completely phase out the use of petroleum based energy sources in all our sectors, whether it is industry or transport or agriculture. And thirdly, we should focus on low carbon fuels like hydrogen. So the next generation of research must take place in how we can develop energy storage systems, how we can develop electric batteries, hydrogen, and how we can decarbonize our industries. So these are broadly the challenges before us as far as India is concerned. And hopefully, and without this kind of innovation, we certainly cannot address the primary challenge of energy generation that is before us in terms of coal. Coal continues to be the major source of our energy, almost 65% of our primary energy, but 72% of our electricity generation. So we have a big challenge here. If we replace coal with renewables, it will involve not only stranded assets, but also huge employment issues for a large number of people who are dependent on coal sector. So this involves reskilling, re-engineering, redeployment, social issues. So the 3 to 4 key challenges before us are innovations in terms of technology, just transition, and finding the resources for scaling up our investments into renewables. I'll stop here, and I hope I have made myself clear, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.